Mike so much for being with us. This is Mike Deetsch, our Leah Bippus, Director of Education and Engagement. So Mike, you came to the museum in the education department. You oversee a bunch of functional areas, including education, and engagement. Would you tell people what engagement includes above and beyond our education department?
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, I think education and engagement are really linked, especially when you think about organizations like museums. Learning is core to our mission, but we really have to get people connected to the museum, I think, before we can layer on the learning and education side of it. So, as you said, we have the traditional approach to education, whether those are working with schools or teaching art classes. But my team also is responsible for public programs, which would include concerts, lectures, big events, like the block party is a great example. But also the visitor engagement crew. So they're the folks that are the front line. They're the ones that you first encounter when you visit the museum, and really information specialists on behalf of what's going on at TMA. And then also the Glass Studio. And the Glass Studio is really sort of that key hybrid department that has its foot in education, but also they do daily glassblowing demonstrations. They work with our guest artist pavilion project. So they're working with artists to come to the museum. So it's really, there's a lot of tentacles out there and a lot of overlap between what you would think of as traditional education and how you would define engagement. And again, I know it's education and engagement, but I really see the two as interconnected.
Yeah, so I'm back, obviously, after 2 years away, and you've been at the museum for several years, 7 at this point, or thereabouts, maybe 6?
Just over 7.
So 7 years. So we overlapped last time. And the term that I would hear you use frequently, which I think is so on the money for that hybrid, is edutainment. And I think one of the things people don't realize is that even sort of in the foundation of museums, right, and there are lots of problematic issues in the foundations of museums that we'll come back to, but at the core, museums were meant to be places of education, but also entertainment. Literally, the British Museum was created for as a place of education for the studious and entertainment for the curious. Edutainment is baked in the 18th century. Let's talk a little bit about this notion of edutainment, right, and how you think about the institution, not just as a place to learn, but also as a place to have fun.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, frankly, right now in the 21st century, we have a million different competing options and environments. Not only can people go back to school at any time they want to, whether that's at a community college or their local university, but there are also programs like Coursera where you can take online learning classes. And so as you think about what are ways that art museums can differentiate themselves from traditional learning modes, certainly, again, education is core to who we are, but there are so many competing values. And so this concept of edutainment, which can be sort of pejorative in some ways, it's about how do you hook people through the fun before you can layer in the learning, right? And it's not as binary as that. It's not a first you have fun and then you learn, right? I think, though, you have to build that experience that's going to be interesting and enticing, that people are going to realize that maybe they're not going to be bored, right? Which is a common obstacle that we have to face in art museums. I know you know that. That this is a place for people of all ages, that this is a place for people of all education levels. Frankly, one of the biggest challenges that we face in the art museum field is that the large percentage of our visitors have a college degree or higher. And so you would think then probably the reason why people who don't have a college degree, right, probably feel intimidated or concerned about coming here, that they have to have a certain knowledge base. And so, I think education departments, whether or not they have the engagement moniker added onto it, what we're really working hard to do is to make this building and art specifically more accessible, more fun, right? How can you come to an art museum and have a good time? Because frankly, like making art is a fun thing to do, right? And so we want to make sure that that we're providing those experiences, and learning, if done well, should be inherently baked in to those experiences, right?
So there are about 8 different directions I'd like to go with what you just said, but let's start with this idea of
Let's just start with 6.
deal.
We can.
Okay, all at once. So no, first I want to unpack this idea of fun, right? And this idea that people can come to an art museum and have fun, whoever you are, whatever your background. Art museums are for anyone. And I think one of the ways you think about fun, which I think is right, which is why, right, you're a great team member, is that fun is about engaging multiple senses, right? And in fact, when you think about what are the things I do that are fun, I think most people will realize that, maybe with the exception of reading, which is sort of a weird outlier for a different conversation, fun is social and fun is multisensory. Usually when you're doing something fun, you're doing it with someone else and you're engaging multiple senses. So how does that affect the way you think about museum experience, about education and engagement?
Yeah, well, again, it's probably not surprising, but one of the things that we know about our visitors is 90% of our visitors come with someone else. So that is inherently social, the way it's baked in, right? People are already coming because they want to spend time with their family, with their friends. So why not develop experiences that are, whether they're multi-generational or it's with couples or friends working together, right? So if you can sort of start with that, where the visitors are coming from. But yeah, look, again, art museums in this country have been around, 120 years, maybe 140 years. And I think still, unfortunately, for a vast majority of Americans, the vision is that you have to walk into the building. The moment you do, you have to be quiet. You have to keep your hands to your side and you sort of contemplate your way through. Now, I think there is a time and a place for that, right? Because to your point about this multisensory experience, people connect in a variety of ways. But what about those people that want to talk? What about those people that want to look at a painting and they want to laugh together? Or they want to yell at the painting for whatever reason, right? Not that anybody would yell at a Van Gogh, but maybe you find that urge, right, to want to do so. And so how do we, it's, again, going back to this idea, it's not an either or, it's a both and, right? So we want to have the experience where somebody can walk into our cloister and they can be by themselves and they can sort of take it in as this serene spiritual experience. And we also want to be able to set up a rock concert in the cloister as well for those people, right, that may not ever want to come into the cloister, right? And so again, it's this idea of you got to find people, you got to meet them where they are, and how do you bring them in? And hopefully, right, they come in for the rock concert and they look around the cloister and they're like, this is really amazing. First of all, I've never seen a concert in a space like this, but now that the band's gone, I want to come back and I want to see these cool things up close.
Yeah, so I have a 7-year-old, as you know, and he rides his bike sometimes with your son. And one of the analogies I'm sort of like homing in on, maybe it's because it's summer, is a pool. Right? A pool, no fun pool has only lap time. Right? The pool has an opportunity for you to swim laps, and it has an opportunity for kids to jump in off the side catching footballs as you toss them their way. Right? So there are all sorts of spaces that have the both and museums not only should, but museums have a history of doing just that over a much longer arc. Sort of this modern experience of the museum as this quiet contemplative space is quite different from what that 1753 British Museum would have been like. But so let's so thank you for that sort of excursus on fun. So let's come back around to this idea of education then. So this is I think this is a really broad conception of education, which makes sense for an informal learning environment like ours. And TMA, of course, has always been engaged in arts education. Literally in the first sentence of our statement of purpose, it says we exist for the display of artwork, but also for arts instruction. So we're a nonprofit educational institution, 501c3, with a purpose of art education. Like director of education is like the biggest job there is, arguably. So how does a director of education engage colleagues across the museum when everything we're supposed to be doing is education? Like, just how do you conceive of interacting with your colleagues and making sure education is the way you think about education is central to the way we think about education in all other areas of the institution?
Yeah, I mean, look, that's a great question, and I think that there's a challenge that it provides that I like. So one of the things, particularly for an organization of our size, the education and engagement department can't own education singularly, right? To your point, if our purpose is art education, everybody must embody that. And so frankly, I think that our role, like our team, this education and engagement team, is that maybe we're the best advocates, right? We're the champions. We're the folks that are also willing and encouraging of partnerships across the organization, right? So whether that is Allison Huftelin in the library, right? Making her collection more accessible, which I know that she is constantly striving to do, right? To make this great resource library available. Or working with the curators, right? To not only plan their exhibitions, but to help give them that public space and that public voice for talking, right? So again, this can take on a myriad of things and approaches that we would want to do. And so again, I don't think there's sort of an easy answer to this. I don't think there's a right. This is what education is, because frankly, it's always changing too, right? I mean, look, if there's anything the last 3 months have shown us is how much the world has changed, continues to change, but like it's different from where we were 5 years ago and 10 years ago. And so this notion of informal learning, or what learning should really be like, I think takes on any number of things, right? It takes on any number of masks and disguises and approaches. And I think, one of the great benefits about working in an art museum, but specifically TMA, is how creative and enthusiastic everybody is. I mean, like across the board, and how everybody is really into and bought into the visitor experience, right? And so it's easy, I think, in many ways, because of the history and legacy that we have here. It's an easy sell for the staff here. They want to do it, right? And so it's how do we support, how do we champion on their behalf?
Yeah, so I think I said in another interview, I can't remember, but it's certainly a line of mine that institutions have DNA, right? And I sort of grew up a New York Giants fan, and it doesn't matter who's on the Giants, right? The Giants play up or down to the level of their opponent, always, right? They snatch defeat from the jaws of victory no matter who they play. You can take the players away, it's just the culture of the place. The culture of TMA is that we care deeply about art education, and the people who are attracted to working here know it. And if you don't know it and you come in a different function, it's ambient, right? Mm-hmm. It's in the air. So I think that's really, really wise and really well spotted. So your answer brings us back around to sort of another line of questioning, which is related to changes in our world over the past several months, right? And you even made a metaphorical allusion to masks, so you couldn't have teed it up any better. So how has COVID changed the way you think about this, Mike? And you've mentioned a couple of times specifically how digital has affected education and has affected experience. So A, how has COVID interrupted in-presence, in real life experience, and how are you adapting? And B, what are the opportunities that you see for digital engagement?
Yeah, as we've discussed prior to this, and as you're alluding to, we are a community institution, right? Again, if you look at our visitation, a high percentage of our visitors live here in Toledo, right? So while we have an international reputation, we don't have an international visitation, right? We don't have a national visitation by and large, right? So we have been that organization that people have come to. And that's great, right? We have really high visitation. We have really high repeat visitation, which is even better, right? Because when people love us, they love us, right? That again, that's one of the great points of working here at TMA. But to your point, right, during this shutdown, during this pandemic, and people can't leave, they can't leave their houses, we can't be at the museum, that totally turned our model upside down. And so I'm really happy with the efforts that we've taken to pivot some of our experiences to online learning. And it's been a huge learning curve for us to figure out, hey, if you're used to coming in and doing a glass blowing class, how do we make that experience the same through YouTube, right? Short answer is you can't. But there are ways that you can still connect and you can still engage. And I think one of the things that's been really awesome, again, we live also in some ways in a very forgiving time because we're, as people have been chanting for a while, we're all in this together. People are willing to forgive maybe the audio visual quality of the experiences that we've been able to roll out on the immediate, right? Because it was like we were scrambling like everybody else was. But the thing that was really sort of affirming to me was that, we rolled out 15 virtual art classes and they all sold out right away. People still want to connect with the museum. We still want to connect with those visitors. And so again, going back to this idea of not an either or, but a both and, right? COVID's going to pass at some point. We're going to be able to be in spaces where we don't have to be socially distant, where we don't have to wear masks anymore, where we don't have to sanitize every single thing that we touch. But I think that there are new behaviors that we have totally absorbed in this 3-month, 4-month period, right? Technology is one of those, right? I mean, look, we have been consumed by smartphones and smart devices for years, but I think largely from social media and from, texting and email, but I think video communication has just only amplified. And so I think even once we're past this, there are learned behaviors that will not go away, that people will still want the on-site experience. They'll still want to pick up a paintbrush in the family center, but people are still going to want to go on our YouTube channel and take a drawing lesson, right? And that's where actually we do have the opportunity of taking our audience and growing it beyond the Toledo area as well, right? Because of course with digital, with the World Wide Web, right? We have the opportunity, we can connect with people on a national and international level. That's really exciting, right? Not leaving behind the folks that we have here, but being able to grow because of this digital capacity.
So this idea of amplifying what we're already doing, of adding on as opposed to leaving behind, I think is so important. So first of all, the team has done an extraordinary job getting things up and running, adapting to this new normal, next normal, whatever we want to call it. How do you think about investing in digital going forward so we're not scrambling again in the event we have another dislocation, whether it's a second wave of this virus or some other unforeseen black swan event?
Yeah, I mean, look, this is the $64,000 question right here, right? Because to your point, we don't know what the next thing is going to be, right? And there will be a next thing, and maybe it's not as like crippling as COVID-19. Hopefully, it's not. But I think that we do have to be thoughtful. We have to have this long-term. I think as we talked early on, right, within a couple of weeks of this, I was like knocking on your door, metaphorically speaking, saying we need to invest in digital. And one of the things that you kept reminding me of was that's fine, but let's also think about that 3 to 5 year strategy and where we are. So it is this balance about, are we equipped for right now? Because again, COVID could potentially last into 2021, and we want to be able to still stay connected to our visitors, to our guests, to connect with new folks. So this idea of let's have the technology, let's have the expertise on hand, and that doesn't necessarily mean that we need to go out and buy the most expensive equipment or hire a bunch, like a team, to be able to execute this. But I think to your point, where my team was back in March and where they are now, if we have to totally pivot again, we're going to feel much more comfortable because we've already gone through some of the bumps. We've ironed some of the things out. Sure, there are things that we can grow and improve on. It would be great to have a studio, right? Like a green screen studio. But again, if we go back to a shutdown, we're not going to be able to come here and access it. So how do we think through what's important now, but how does that map on to our longer term engagement experiences.
Absolutely. So, so we'll come back to sort of advice you'll have for me at the close of the interview. But as we work through what our digital strategy is and understanding, just as you said, and as we discussed, the institutions that have been best positioned to leverage digital content aren't those that scrambled quickest. They're those that have invested in digital as part of their core operating for a while now. So it's not about trying to hit a home run today. It's about trying to hit singles over a long period of time, and over time that will accumulate. But we are expecting people to come back to the museum. We're open to the museum now. We are, of course, carefully monitoring the situation to determine when we can relaunch in-person classes. But when we do, we will have some exciting new additions to our class roster. So I just think it would be important for you to share with people some of what you're thinking on and some of the investments we're making, particularly on the other side of the street and the Glass Pavilion, in terms of sort of new course offerings that we may be rolling out. So maybe sharing a little bit about some of the work we've been doing on our metal studio and our Glass Pavilion.
Yeah, so really excited. We have relocated our sculpture program and outfitted a new studio over in the Woodruff Conference Center. So that for a long time is where we have housed our jewelry program. And then we have some other spaces over there, including our grounds crew setup. But we've been able to outfit a sculpture studio where we're able to offer blacksmithing, welding, fabrication and forging, as well as casting. So again, some of the offerings that we've had before, but really excited that we're able to open this new space. Not only is it in close proximity to sort of its sister program, the jewelry program, but also in close proximity to the Glass Pavilion, right? It's actually in the same parking lot where people park to go to the Glass Pavilion. And there's a lot of synergy between metals and glass, not least of which is an enameling class that we offer in jewelry. And as we know, enameling is a form of glass. It's powdered glass, right? So there's some natural overlap there. And then within the Glass Pavilion itself, right, we have these world-class, not only glass collection and building in which it's all housed, but we also have a world-class glass studio that's equipped with a hot shop, flame working studio, mold making studio, cold shop where you can grind and polish your work, as well as flat glass, making stained glass. One of the additions that we are working on right now is a neon studio. And so we're outfitting our flame working studio to have a dual purpose function. It's funny, we might think of neon as sort of a new art form, and I guess in many ways it is, right? It didn't really rise in popularity until the 1960s. But of course, neon it's a gas, it's an element, right? It's been around as long as the earth has been around, right? And even as early as the turn of the 20th century, right, neon was starting to make its way into commercial venues and commercial outlets. And, just like with everything else, as we want to be on the forefront for a number of different ways, whether that's our own collection, the studio glass movement and the importance of that back in 1962, neon is sort of the next iteration of that, right? So it's really exciting to see where we can take that program, how we can get it to grow. And then just to sort of circle back around a little bit as well, thinking about what's going to happen over on this side of the street and thinking about our digital offerings. For years we've been tooling around with digital classes and digital offerings, whether that's coding classes and offering that through the lens of something like Minecraft or video animation, stop motion animation. I think, one of the things that we're trying to do with the Neon Studio, with digital offerings, is also be responsive to the way the collection is changing, right? When this program was started in 1903, right? The traditional forms of art were drawing and painting and printmaking and sculpture, right? Those are the class offerings that we had. But as we move into this realm of new technology, and you can walk into any one of our galleries and see a neon piece, of course, see photography, digital photography at that, you can see video clips, right? I want to be responsive to that because one of the ways, going back to this idea of fun and engagement, one way to connect people with our collection is to to put them into that role of maker, right? And that's how they start to understand what that process is, and then they begin to connect with the content that's there.
Which, incidentally, is multisensory and fun, right? So you're embedding learning, you're connecting with the collection, and you're having a hands-on, fun experience, the trifecta. So to move on to sort of, maybe our final substantive meaty topic. So as the person responsible for engagement, while that's a corollary to education, it of course is outward looking and engaging of the community, right? And the whole community, thinking through our service to our city and our region, Toledo, Northwest Ohio. We are the Toledo Museum of Art, not the Libby Museum of Art. We are named for this place because we were meant to serve this place. But you just alluded, even in that conversation about medium, to the expansion of the view of what is considered fine art, right? And the history of having Joseph Kossuth and Libby Court, or having Bill Viola that will go on display shortly, a video work that was acquired several years ago and hasn't been viewed, is an expansion, right, or an undoing, you could say, of the hierarchy of Western art history. Right, Western art history was paintings and it was sculptures, and it's still very much reflected in the Toledo Museum of Art display. That museums are wonderful places, but we are legacies of a history, and that history brings with it certain institutional bias. That is also true of the artists represented in our collection, and it is true of the way that we have historically as an institution thought about community engagement. Come here, right? And in fact, Toledo Museum of Art was ahead of the curve, reducing barriers to entry. We've been free since 1901, but that's not sufficient, right? We need to be more actively engaged with our community, even outside of our walls. So I know this is something you're thinking actively about, particularly in this current moment, as we have discussions long overdue at the intensity level that we're having them about racial equality. So talk to me a little bit about how you view the museum playing in that conversation, and how you think about community engagement in this context.
Mm-hmm. Look, that's a great question, and I am so glad that we are addressing this, that we're tackling this, right? Because I think you actually, to me, you hit the nail on the head when you reinforced and reaffirmed that this is the Toledo Museum of Art, not the Libby Museum of Art, right? I think I believe, right, as a community anchor here, we have to be responsive to the needs of the people of Toledo, right? And again, this isn't an either or. This is a both and proposition here, right? We're very fortunate, right? We have a beautiful collection. We're in a beautiful building. We have a beautiful campus in which other buildings rest. But I want to think about, what does Toledo really need right now? And if at the end of the day, it is a traditional art museum, that is great. Like, let's make sure that is available and accessible to the people of Toledo. But again, you mentioned our founding in 1901, which is when, the museum gets underfoot. Does the city of Toledo still need a museum from 1901? And I know that we've evolved, we've changed. It's been over 100 years, right? But like, how can we be more responsive, knowing that education in this city is a real challenge, right? We know that majority of children entering kindergarten are not entering ready to be a kindergartner, whether that's from the social emotional side or from the reading side. We know that there's a high level of poverty here in the city. We know that there is racial disparity here in the city. And I am certainly not suggesting that the Toledo Museum of Art is going to be the great white hope or the great savior that comes in and solves society's ills. But what I do think is, let's push ourselves. Let's allow the city of Toledo to push us, to tell us what they really need. I think that libraries have really done a great job. Public libraries have done a great job over the last 10, 15, 20 years to reshifting who they are. They used to be viewed as a repository for books, which in turn was a repository for knowledge, right? And they've been able to stretch and grow that. I think in many ways we've done similar things, right? The Center of Visual Expertise is a great example. Who would have ever thought that an art museum would get into the business of safety training, right? But it turns out that there are overlaps and there are parallels. So again, I think it's having that level of flexible thinking that we need to be willing and be open to and accept and embrace. And so when somebody comes to us and says, I challenge you, right? Our default shouldn't be, but this is who we are, right? Our default should be, I hear that challenge. Help me work through this. Let's do this together.
So start with yes, don't start with no, right? Figuring things out and figuring out compromise is absolutely the right approach. I'd also add, you didn't use the term, but what I hear you saying implicitly is, how can we be a partner to, as opposed to how can we solicit support for something we're doing? And it's partnership one way or another, but it's not subordinating interest, it's authentic engagement and trying to lift all boats using this extraordinary resource, right? Because institutional bias notwithstanding, it is an extraordinary resource. So let's use it to benefit everyone. So, the other thing I want to just ask about quickly is, so we are in, and I'm not sure it's clear to people just viewing us on the screen, we are in the terrace room, which is sort of at the back of the cafe. And from where I am seated, I can look out over the Lincoln Avenue Bridge and see the sign for Detroit Avenue and Monroe Street for the exit off of I-75. And I think one of the things that I've shared with donors, I've shared with staff, is how fortunate we are to be living through a global pandemic, right? At an institution that has made it through the last global pandemic. It is an incredibly reassuring thing to be sitting in a building that was here in 1918 and is still here doing well. So when you have institutional memory, it's easy to remember, right, through the institution, that road that I'm looking at right there hasn't always been there. Frankly, hasn't been there for most of this institution's history. And while we frequently talk about the museum as being part of the Old West End, this was a contiguous neighborhood once, and part of the strategy of engaging in authentic partnerships has to be imagining, right, our radius as a contiguous neighborhood as it was. So it's not just about the Old West End, it's also about Englewood and Roosevelt and the Dorr Street community, Dorr Street corridor, right, down to the river, out to ProMedica Hospital, everything in between. So I think Mike, one of the things we don't do a great job of is telling people how much we're already doing. So talk a little bit about some of the partnerships we have just within that radius already, which of course we're going to build on and strengthen.
Yeah, so, and again, this is hopefully an ever-growing list and an ever-growing program. One of the areas I'm most proud of is our after-school program, which has been in existence since the 1970s. This is where we work with after-school providers, and they come to the museum and they have art-making experiences here, and we get them connected to the collection. We have gone out and we have done projects at various organizations, whether that's the Boys and Girls Club, which we have one of the longest standing partnership relationships, particularly engaging their youth. We've done murals out at the East Toledo Family Center. We've worked very closely with the Zeff Center through after-school experiences, through the great work that the Family Center does. So I totally agree. Right, I think it's very easy to see ourselves sort of isolated, right? As BBB, Buyer Blender Bell, sort of told us a couple of years ago on the master plan, right? We live within this asphalt necklace, right? And so we can isolate ourselves because of that, but we have to remember that we are part of a community, right? Not just the city of Toledo, but to your point, there are neighborhoods that abut us all around. Neighborhoods that we were closer to because we didn't have this barrier of I-75. But I think that the work still continues, right? the work that we've been doing with the beautifully designed and reopened Mott Branch Library, working with our teens and our teen leaders over there. So I think that there are so many opportunities, or Jones Leadership Academy, which is just down off of Collingwood. We worked with their chess club a few years ago to help us design larger than life chess pieces that you can play in the galleries. And so, again, this is, to your question, I think this sort of goes back to this idea of what do we need right now? How do we be relevant, right? How do we get people connected with the museum? And maybe that's about coming into the museum. Hopefully it's about coming into the museum. But I think more importantly, and maybe where part of your point is going, how do we push ourselves out into these neighborhoods? And by these neighborhoods, I mean the ones that literally touch the museum, that for a long time, maybe we haven't done that, right? So this is where it's like pushing ourselves, pushing that narrative a little differently than maybe what we're used to and what we're comfortable with.
Yeah, and I think just to drive home the point, and I know you agree with this, right? And this is the shift frame for us, and we've been talking about it. These neighborhoods is our neighborhood, right? Collectively, right? And that's and contiguously, right? The maps, right, are not static.
Right.
And you and I both spent time in New York, and we know that real estate developers will come up with brand new neighborhood names overnight if they think neighborhoods are not static. Names of neighborhoods are not static. The Toledo Museum of Art is an anchor for its community, collectively, contiguously, and that is a huge opportunity. So the other thing about the terrace room is it is very hot. Lots of ambient heat in here, so I'll get you out of here on this question. What advice would you give for me as I think through education and engagement at the Toledo Museum of Art as I continue my onboarding and we embark on strategic planning?
Yeah, maybe the first one is, if you're going to put me on the hot seat, don't put me on the literal hot seat as we are in the terrace here. I guess, you're a very thoughtful person, and I know that you think a lot about the meaning of the museum and where the museum should go and how we can be responsive. I guess I would just continue you to think through that, particularly as it pertains to education, right? And not what have we done, although we don't want to lose sight of our history, but challenging your own perception or conception of what education can be and what it should be, right? Because even to the point of the neighborhoods, education, right? Learning is learning in some regards, but the way that we learn and the way that we consume and the way that we connect, that changes, and it always changes. We forget that sometimes, right? I mean, I'm sure you've had the same conversations with your parents where it's like, that's not how I learned in school, right? And that will continue. Your son will say the same thing, and his children will say the same thing. That's not how I learned, because it is constantly changing. And I think we have to be willing to accept that mindset here at TMA. And I think we are.
That is great advice. Thank you so much, Mike.
Thank you.